Chapter 13 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 13. The Pool in Wales That Lures People to Death. I think there is very little doubt that two of the mediums through which the occult forces get at humanity are colour and locality. Red, for example, being the colour of blood, is made the medium for instilling thoughts of murder. Green, in a similar manner, is used to suggest suicide by drowning. Yellow suggests madness. Pink, vice of the most alluring and attractive nature, and so on. Until, by a careful study of human crimes and their relation to colour, one might tabulate a complete list. And so with localities. Certain spots attract certain types of spirits, and these in turn suggest certain thoughts, some beautiful and some the reverse. I was still in North Wales when, a week or so before the expiration of the tour, I did a day's tramping on the hills. And, being caught in a heavy rainstorm, I had to take shelter under one of those low stone walls with which the whole countryside is intersected. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and the fading light made me a bit anxious as to how I should find my way back to my lodgings. As I was crouching there, praying to heaven that the storm would soon cease so that I could continue my way, I suddenly heard a loud cry, as of someone in distress, and on its being repeated, I scrambled up and hastened in the direction of the sounds. About 100 yards further on there was a break in the wall, and I caught the glimmer of water. It was one of those roadside pools, not uncommon in Wales, and usually of great depth. As I drew nearer, I saw it was fringed on the far side by a cluster of tall pines that creaked and groaned dismally as the strong west wind drove volumes of water through their bowed branches. I was noticing all this when the form of a man in a mackintosh rose from the gorse close by my side, and thrusting his head forward so that I could not see his face, walked with great swinging strides towards the pool. I thought this rather queer, but I thought it still queerer when the cries I had heard before broke out again with increased violence, unmistakably this time from the trees, and the man, breaking into a run, rushed up to the margin of the pool, where he abruptly disappeared. I was close behind him at the time, and am positive he did not enter the water. His whole body seemed to melt away as he stood on the bank. What became of him I could not say. I only know he vanished. The incident so unnerved me that it was only with a considerable effort of mind that I went on. I threaded my way through the trees and looked everywhere, but there was no one about, and nothing whatever, as far as I could see, to account for the sounds. I looked at the water. It was inky black, and there was something sinister about it, and something that strangely suggested to me that away down in the cold, still depths was life, some peculiar, venomous, repellent living thing that was watching me, and longing to entwine its arms round me and drag me ruthlessly down. I was appalled. The apparent loneliness of the spot was frightful, and as I tore myself away and renewed my journey home, I fancied I heard laughter in which all the trees seemed to join in chorus. On arriving at my rooms, I inquired about the pool, and my landlady informed me it bore a very evil reputation. Several people had been found drowned there, and no one would go near it after dark. This stimulated me to make further enquiries. I came across one or two men who testified to having heard cries there, and one old woman who declared she had seen a curious figure, half human and half animal, vanish in the pine trees, but I could get nothing in the way of details for some months, not until I had returned to London, when, quite by chance and under rather extraordinary circumstances, I was introduced to a man, long since dead, who many years before had had a somewhat harrowing experience there. The gist of what he narrated to me was as follows. Philip Delaney was a member of the London Stock Exchange, and at 9:30 one August evening was sitting before the empty grate in his study, smoking. Though not naturally a pessimist, his thoughts were at that moment excessively gloomy. Business during the last few years had been steadily getting worse and worse, and it now seemed as if the day of general stagnation must be very near at hand. From an average of 1,500 a year, his income had fallen to less than 800. Consequently, he could not, as usual, take his holiday abroad. He could only just afford to send his wife and children to Hastings, where he might possibly be able to join them for week-ends. As a fitting accompaniment to his thoughts, the weather was vile, cold, and wet, eternally wet. He could hear the raindrops beating against the glass and falling on the window-sill with an incessant, wearying and worrying patter. He was too depressed to read. It was too early to sleep. He could only sit and think, everlastingly think. Indeed, he was deeply engaged in thought in which 2 and 2.5 percentages were paramount, when, hearing someone cough, he turned sharply round. No one was there. This was odd. He could have sworn the sound came from just behind him. With his eyes focused on the door, he listened. The cough was repeated, footsteps accompanied it, and from out of the wall stepped the figure of a man. Philip Delaney gasped in astonishment. He recognized the figure at once. It was Markham Davidson, a very old friend of his, the author of several well-known works on metaphysics and psychology. There was nothing peculiar about him. Features, complexion, expression, clothes, and walk were all perfectly natural. They belonged to the Markham Davidson he knew, but whom he had not seen for ages. And yet how, if he were flesh and blood, had he passed through several inches of solid brick and mortar? How? Unquestionably he could not have done so, unless he had suddenly acquired superphysical properties, and projected his immaterial body after the manner of one of the phantasms about which he was so fond of writing. Walking across the room with a quick tread, the figure displayed certain mannerisms, a forward poke of the head, a prematurely old stoop of the shoulders, and a bend of the arms, unmistakably those of Davidson. Delaney noted, too, that Markham looked remarkably well. His cheeks were ruddy and full, his eyes were bright, his movements full of energy. In one hand he carried a stamped envelope, and in the other an umbrella, with which he tapped the ground vigorously as he walked. He moved in a straight line without looking to the right or left, and, stepping into the wall a few feet from the window, disappeared before Delaney could utter a sound. As the whole occurrence had occupied so short a space of time, 3 or 4 seconds at the most, Delaney tried hard to persuade himself that the phenomena was an hallucination. But, try as he would, he could not bring himself to believe that what he had seen was entirely subjective. There on the wall was the very spot where the figure had emerged, and there, exactly opposite, the very spot through which it had vanished. No hallucination, he argued, could have been so vivid, nor could it have embraced so many graphic and minute details. Details! Yes, crowds of details. He remembered them all distinctly, especially the tie. There was a redness about it, a very peculiar redness he did not recollect seeing in any other tie. It impressed him greatly, and he could not eradicate it from his mind. He noticed the envelope, too, not so much because it was addressed to P. Delaney, Esquire, as because it was white, startlingly white, whilst the stamp was the same very pronounced red as the tie. Long after the figure had gone, Philip pondered over these idiosyncrasies, and the more he thought of them, the more perplexed he grew. What he had seen was, without doubt, the phantasm of Markham Davidson, of the living Markham Davidson, identical with his old friend Markham Davidson in all but the colour of the tie. Red, blood red. What on earth could have possessed Davidson to wear such a colour? He pondered over this as deeply as though it had been one of the most weighty problems of the Stock Exchange, and when he went to bed that night and looked in his mirror, he saw, instead of his own tie, a blood-red one. His dreams took disturbing forms. 3 times following he saw Markham Davidson struggling for dear life in a dreary-looking pool, situated by the side of a very lonely mountain road, and overshadowed by tall pines that creaked and groaned like lost souls every time the wind smote them. With such perspicuity were the details in these dreams stamped on his mind, that each time he awoke he saw them again. There they were, everywhere he turned. The glimmering white road with the wide expanse of snow on one side, and on the other the long line of low stone wall, beyond which lay darkness and the pool. Heavens, what a pool it was! Inky black, unfathomably deep, and hideously suggestive of an antagonistic, insatiable something that lay crouching in its bosom, ever on the lookout for prey. Delaney was fascinated. Although he realized that the very atmosphere of the place was intensely evil, that it had a wholly demoralizing effect and contaminated everybody and everything that came near it. Although absolutely he understood all this, yet he allowed himself to be drawn unresistingly towards it. When he awoke from one vision of it, he craved heaven and hell to permit him to see another, and in this manner he passed the whole night. On coming down to breakfast, the first thing that arrested his attention was an envelope addressed to him in the well-known writing of Markham Davidson. He tore it open, and with breathless excitement read as follows: "Dear Phil, it is a very long time since I heard from you. An irresistible craze has just come over me to go to North Wales. Strange, because, as I dare say you remember, I have always detested Wales. Now, however, I am eaten up with a mad desire to go to Llangynni, an out-of-the-way spot somewhere near Cader Idris. I never heard of it till yesterday, when it suddenly attracted my attention as I was gazing at an atlas. Will you join me there for a day or two? I go tomorrow, Wednesday, and intend staying a week. It would be very pleasant once again to tramp the countryside with you." Delaney looked at the postmark. It was stamped 11:30 p.m. Could Davidson have been on the way to the pillar box when he, Delaney, had seen his phantasm? If that were so, then undoubtedly it was a case of unconscious projection. Markham, whilst thinking of him, Delaney, in connection with the invitation to Llangynni, had unconsciously separated his immaterial from his material body and projected it. Delaney had read 1 or 2 books on psychic phenomena, and understood from them that spirit projection was not only quite feasible, but far from uncommon. However, he could not accept Davidson's invitation. He had not the money. Go to Llangynni, indeed. Why, Davidson might as well have asked him to travel to Petrograd. And yet the pool, that white road, those shaking pine trees, that lurking invisible something. Could he resist? For a solid hour he battled with himself, battled till the sweat rose to his brow and poured down his throat and chest. Then he decided. To join Davidson was utterly out of the question. He had neither the time, money, nor inclination. Like the majority of writers, Davidson was a creature of impulse, erratic and irresponsible. He, Philip Delaney, was different. He was a materialist, wholly practical and level-headed. He never acted on the spur of the moment, never chased wild geese. In a very superior frame of mind he sat down and wrote to Davidson, expressing his extreme regret at not being able to accept his invitation. Then he got up, breathed a sigh of relief, and clapping on his hat, went off to business. All that day, however, whilst he was brooding over figures in his office, and listening to the ceaseless babble at the exchange, his mind reverted to the pool. It was that black piece of water, always that water, and Davidson in his red tie, always that particular red tie, struggling in it. At last he could stand it no longer. He felt that even if he had to sell his wife and house and children, he must yield to this attraction, this damnable attraction, and go. Darting out of his office, shortly after luncheon, he hurried to the railway station and took the first train home. In less than half an hour he had made all the necessary arrangements for a brief absence, packed his valise, and secured a hansom. All this happened long before the advent of taxis. The train was an express to Chester, but the rest of the journey was slow, and it was 9 o'clock before he found himself on the single platform of Llangelly, the nearest station to Llanginney. Delaney inquired as to how he was to reach his destination, and was informed by the solitary porter that, if he wished to get there, he must walk. "There ain't no vehicles for hire in this part of the country," the porter said. "Everyone that comes here has to use their feet. You can't mistake the road. You've only to keep straight on, and you are bound to arrive there." Delaney smiled grimly. He felt as little like walking as he had ever done in his life, and, besides his Gladstone, he had a raincoat and umbrella. Fortunately, the night was fine, and ere he had covered his first half-mile, the moon broke out from behind a cloud and illuminated the entire landscape. For the next mile or two the road was fairly flat, and then it gradually began to rise, the scenery becoming wilder and wilder. Every now and then he paused, and, throwing back his head, drank in deep breaths of the heather-scented air. Delicious! What a change from London! He calculated he must have done about 3/4 of the distance when he arrived at a turning, the entrance to a lane that at once made him shudder. He paused opposite the turning and tried to find some explanation for his fear. It was certainly very lonely, and the white patches of moonlight on the footpath and hedgerows suggested much. But, after all, it was only suggestion which a few sunbeams would at once dissipate. He was standing within the shadow of a clump of firs facing the lane, and looking intently ahead of him, when, at a distance of some 50 or so yards, the figure of a man in a mackintosh slowly emerged from a gap in the hedge. The man merely glanced in Delaney's direction, and then, turning round, moved on down the lane. But the glimpse, momentary though it had been, was sufficient to enable Delaney to identify the person. It was Davidson. He knew him at once by his mannerisms, and he instinctively felt he had on that tie, that flagrantly vulgar blood-red tie. In an instant he formed a resolution. He would give his friend a surprise. With this intention in view, he dropped his valise, and, stepping noiselessly forward, he followed Davidson. On and on they went, the one keeping 50 or so yards behind the other, till there came a sudden bend in the lane, and then Delaney received a shock. Spread out before him, exactly as he had seen it in his dreams, was the panorama of the white glimmering road with the wide, wild expanse of moorland on one side, and on the other the long line of wall and the pool. Nothing could have been more like, and it was intensified by the brilliancy of the moonbeams. Crouching in the heather, Delaney watched Davidson slowly walk up to the edge of the water, fold his arms, and gaze in a reflective manner into the shadowy depths. The moments flew by, and still he gazed. Then there came a brief, distracting interval, during which the moon disappeared behind a bank of black, funereal clouds. When it emerged, the figure of Davidson had vanished, and Delaney occupied the spot where he had stood. "The pool, the greedy, insatiable pool," he muttered. "Dark, deep, and devilish. The 3 Ds. I might even add a fourth. Damnable." And turning round with a chuckle, he was preparing to go, when someone vaulted the stone wall to his left and rapidly approached him. "You don't mean to say you are still pottering about here?" The stranger, a man about Delaney's own height and build, panted. "I thought you had returned to the inn long ago." Then, perceiving his mistake, he said in amazement, "Why, it's someone else. I beg your pardon, sir. I quite thought you were an acquaintance of mine." "Davidson, by any chance?" Delaney asked pleasantly. "Yes, Markham Davidson," the stranger said in astonishment. "Do you know him too?" "I am his old friend," Delaney laughed, "and I am on my way to join him at Llanginney. I merely stopped here to look at the pool." "The pool," the stranger ejaculated, eyeing him curiously. "It is not the pleasantest place in the world, is it?" "No," Delaney replied, "but it has its fascination. Where did you leave Davidson?" "At the entrance to this lane half an hour ago," the stranger answered, scanning the dark surface of the water anxiously. "I wanted to get as far as the brow of the hill over yonder, but as Davidson complained of feeling tired, I set out alone. He said he would follow me slowly and wait for me somewhere about here. Did you, by any chance, hear a cry?" "A cry!" Delaney exclaimed. "A cry? No, did you?" "I thought I did," the stranger said, moving away from the edge of the water. "That is why I hurried here. Perhaps he is somewhere about. Supposing we call." They shouted till they were hoarse, and the great hills opposite hurled back the echoes of their voices, but there was no other reply, not a sign of Davidson. At last the stranger touched Delaney on the arm. "Come," he said with a shiver, "the night air is cold. Davidson must have gone back to the inn, and unless we make haste, we shall be locked out. They go to bed at 11. Very reluctantly Delaney gave up the search, and the men were soon tramping along the road in silence, each apparently too preoccupied with their own thoughts to speak. Occasionally Delaney glanced covertly at his companion, and whenever he did so, he surprised the latter in the act of peeping cautiously at him. Eventually the lights of Llanginney hove in view, and several of the other visitors at the inn strolled out to meet them. "No, Davidson has not returned," was the reply to their inquiries. "We have seen nothing of him since you left. It's not 11 yet, however. He has still half an hour, and on such a night as this it would be practically impossible to lose one's way." Delaney engaged his bed, and half an hour later, as Davidson had not yet come back, he made his way to the landlord's private parlour. On the threshold he met his recent companion. "Who is he?" he inquired of the landlord directly the door was closed, and he heard the stranger's footsteps echoing softly down the passage. "Who is he?" the landlord sleepily exclaimed. "Why, Mr. Hartney, a London lawyer. Quite a well-known man in town, so I am told. No, he has never been here before, and as far as I'm aware, he had never met Mr. Davidson till today. Will I send someone to look for Mr. Davidson? Why, that is what Mr. Hartney has just asked me. No, sir, I have no one to send. And he spoke somewhat testily. Some of my men have gone, those who sleep out, and the rest are in bed. I shall leave the door open. We aren't afraid of burglars in this part of the country. No, as I told Mr. Hartney, there is no fear of the gentleman being lost. He has gone a little further than he intended, that is all. And the landlord yawned so emphatically that Delaney beat a hasty retreat. I'm going to bed, he said as he passed Hartney in the hall. The landlord assures me there is no fear of any harm having befallen Davidson, and that he is sure to turn up all right. Do you think so? The lawyer queried. Delaney nodded. I know Davidson, he said. I have known him since boyhood. He is the least likely person in the world to meet with mishap. I am glad to hear you say so, Mr. Hartney responded. Very glad. I fancied somehow, but there, it must have only been fancy. Being intimately acquainted with Mr. Davidson, you would of course know his voice, and had he really called out, you would certainly have heard him. It is doubtless a mere fancy on my part. Good night. As Delaney wearily climbed the staircase and peeped through the banister, his eyes encountered those of the lawyer steadily following him. Dog-tired, he lost no time in undressing, but when he got into bed he found sleep would not come to him. He lay first on one side and then on the other. He tried not to think. He resorted to every possible device, but it was all of no avail. It was the pool, always the pool and the blood-red tie. He kept seeing them before him, and they continually bade him get out of bed and come to them. At last, unable to resist them any longer, he got up, and after slipping on his clothes, stole noiselessly out into the still and narrow country road. When he had gone a few yards, he thought he heard a door shut behind him, but on turning round and perceiving no one, he attributed it to fancy and went ahead at a brisk pace. At last, to his relief, the pool came in view. There it was, just as he had seen it, moon-kissed and silent, with the huge firs shaking their heads ominously on the far side of it, and the long line of glittering white wall casting its black shadow on the grass and gorse, running away from it, in an apparently interminable line, on the side nearest him. It was a sight he knew he would never forget as long as he lived. Approaching the brink of the pool, he walked slowly round it, peering anxiously into the water. Suddenly he gave a start. Something white abruptly bobbed to the surface. He looked closely at it, and fancied he discerned a face. He was about to attach a name to it, when he heard something behind him. Swinging sharply round, he confronted Hartney. "Good heavens, you here!" he exclaimed. "Whatever brought you out at this time of night?" "I might say the same to you," the lawyer replied. "What brought you here?" "Davidson," Delaney said. "Do you know, I can't help associating him with this pool. It is damnably fascinating." "I can't help associating him with that cry," Hartney remarked. "I am certain it was his voice. Good God, what's that?" And he pointed frantically at the white thing bobbing up and down in the water, just where the moonbeams fell thickest, and not half a dozen yards from where they stood. "Where?" Delaney said, pressing close to him in a great state of excitement. "Where? Ah, I see it now. It's looking towards us. Well, if you wish to know what it is—" He left off abruptly. There was a wild scream, a heavy splash, and he continued his sentence. "That, Mr. Hartney, is the solution you seek to the mystery." And he went back to the inn alone, chuckling. The sequel to this narrative comes as a surprise. Hartney was not drowned. Being a very powerful swimmer and lightly clad, he got to the other side of the pool, and clambering up the bank he wrung the water from his clothes and ran all the way to the inn. On arriving there, to his intense astonishment, he found Davidson safe and sound, and dressed in clothes 2 or 3 sizes too small for him. Davidson's experience had been very similar to his own. Delaney had suddenly seized him round the waist and hurled him into the middle of the pool. There, he declared, he felt something like very big and icy cold hands trying to pull him down. He cried for help and prayed, and as he prayed, the hands relaxed their grasp, and he managed to struggle safely to shore. The shock of what he had gone through, however, was so great that he felt too ill to get back to the inn, and he was compelled to rest a while at a farm, where he obtained a hot bath and a suit of clothes. As Davidson knew Delaney's wife and family, he begged Hartney, for their sake, to keep the affair as secret as possible. The doctor, who was called in to examine Delaney, could not certify him as being actually insane. However, he strongly recommended him to go into a private home for a time, where he would be kept under constant supervision, and Delaney did as the doctor advised. But after being in the home about a month he escaped, and was eventually found drowned in the lonely pool near Llanginney. From the description given me of Delaney, I am under the impression that the figure I saw in the mackintosh was his ghost. But what about the figure Hartney was positive he saw floating in the water? Was it the phantom of someone who had perished there? Or had Davidson again unconsciously projected himself? I incline to the latter. This is the case in toto, and it was told to me by Hartney, who got all the details, apart from those he had himself experienced, direct from Davidson and Delaney. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 14. I go on with the history of my life and narrate a ghostly happening in Liverpool. I gave up acting directly I became engaged to be married. I had no alternative, as my fiancée's parents strongly disapproved of the stage, and so long as I was on it, they would, I knew, never consent to my union with their daughter. But it was rather a wrench, for I really liked acting, and with the exception of the Sunday travelling, the life suited me well. What other occupation to choose was a poser. All the difficulties that had faced me on my return from the States once again presented themselves, and were aggravated by the fact that I was many years older. I was racking my brain to know what to do for the best, when I received a letter from an old friend in Cornwall, who suggested that I should go down there and open up a small preparatory boys' school. It was Hobson's choice, and in the due course of time I found myself once again engaged in the profession I loathed. I started with 4 or 5 pupils, and had worked up my connection till I had nearly 30, when someone, with more money than I, set up on a much bigger scale, and my numbers gradually decreased. I was never an orthodox pedagogue, very much the reverse. I aimed rather at making my pupils manly than at cramming their heads with bookwork, and I think I succeeded. There were exceptions, of course, but my pupils as a whole developed a fondness for games, both cricket and football, that bore subsequent fruit when they left me and went on to the public schools. The out-of-door occupation that formed part of my life now was delightful, but the dry and dull monotony of the schoolroom, and the eternal interference of certain of the parents of my pupils, who wanted everything for nothing, for my fees were ridiculously small, took it out of me so much that I simply longed to throw up the whole thing and get back to my dearly beloved stage or writing. It was while I was in Cornwall that I got my first book, For Satan's Sake, taken. Mr. Ranger Gull, who was at that time reader for Mr. Arthur Greening's publishing house, read the manuscript and was so pleased with it that he recommended it strongly for publication. It was accepted, but did not appear in print for fully a year. The Unknown Depths, which I had written in St. James Road, Brixton, followed. Then Jenny Barlow, which I wrote between school hours in Cornwall in the spring of 1906. Then Dinevah the Beautiful, the last of my efforts in Brixton. The latter appeared in 1907. In the winter of 1908, my wife was ill, and in the evenings, when my harassing duties in the schoolroom were over, I used to sit by her bedside evolving fresh plots. It was then that I first conceived the idea of writing a ghost book. In my holidays, which I usually spent in London or the Midlands, never in Cornwall, I always flew away from the precincts of the schoolroom the moment we broke up. I had often gone ghost hunting, and I now determined to make use of my experiences. Consequently, I mapped out a synopsis of a work on haunted houses, which was at once accepted by Mr. Everleigh Nash, who commissioned me to write a book on those lines. I did this in the summer of 1908, and the book, which appeared in the autumn of that year and was entitled Some Haunted Houses of England and Wales, created something of a sensation. It was not only extensively reviewed by the London papers, but by many of the American and colonial ones as well. From that time onward my pen has rarely been idle, and, apart from compiling some dozen or so works on the superphysical, I have written innumerable short stories and articles. Indeed, so associated has my name become with everything appertaining to the psychic that publishers are inclined to the idea that I cannot write upon any other subject. In this, however, I venture to think they are mistaken, for my two works, The Reminiscences of Mrs. E. M. Ward and The Irish Abroad, both published by Sir Isaac Pitman and Company, have been very favourably reviewed by both the press and public. It was, however, the success of this first work of mine on ghostly phenomena that made me realize that what I had longed hoped for had at last come within measurable distance of attainment. I could give up teaching and devote my time once again wholly and solely to writing. Never shall I forget with what joy, with what unbounded and infinite joy, I hailed the prospect of leaving forever behind me all those weary, dreary hours in the schoolroom, where I had been forced to display a patience I never had, and where I had been forced to assume a virtue I never really possessed, namely, a love of teaching. I made public my intention of giving up the school in the summer of 1908, and the following winter saw me snugly ensconced in a little house in Upper Norwood, where I have been ever since. Several writers, one of whom I had the pleasure of meeting in London quite recently, his brilliant character studies of young and charming girls figure monthly in certain of the popular magazines, have been credited with introducing to the public, none too favourably, this Cornish colony amongst whom I lived. If they have done so, I can certainly endorse their sentiments. In no other town that I have been in have I ever met people who laid themselves open to such unfavourable criticism. I lived there nearly 8 years, and during that time I received the bare minimum of hospitality. I found the greater number of the inhabitants bigoted and pharisaical, and the townfolk and labouring people not only extremely ignorant, but very unforgiving and vindictive. That they were still, that is to say, at the time I am writing of, in a tribal state, was proved by their puerile attitude of hostility to strangers, whom they used frequently to insult and annoy. I signed 2 petitions relative to the throwing of stones at visitors, which petitions were forwarded to the Home Secretary. The result was nil. The local authorities, in dealing with such cases, displayed the most woeful apathy, and apparently this state of affairs was irremediable, since the magistrates, with few exceptions, were related to half the people in the town. With the art colony I had very little to do. The few artists I knew at all intimately I liked. I found them congenial and generally sympathetic, though displaying an avidity in criticizing authors, which, considering their touchiness with regard to any criticism of their own work, was distinctly amusing. All the same, apart from this and one other harmless peculiarity, namely, an exaggerated and unblushing deference to titles, I found them very good fellows, and nearly all the hospitality I received in the town I received from them. I think I am right in saying that there was never a very friendly feeling between the townspeople and the artists. The townspeople looked upon the artists as intruders, foreigners, whose ways and habits were diametrically opposite to theirs, especially with regard to the treatment of the Sabbath, whilst the artists showed a none too well concealed contempt for the townspeople, whom they seemed to regard not only as hopelessly inartistic, but of an utterly inferior breed. In most small towns there is a good deal of unkind gossip and scandal, but I really think that in this respect the town I refer to was unrivalled. It seemed to me that the people were never so happy as when saying malicious things about each other, and they meanly victimized those whose limited means would not permit of their taking legal action against them. I have often wondered what made these people so peculiarly unkind. As soon as I had settled down in Norwood, I wrote Ghostly Phenomena, which was reviewed at length by Andrew Lang in the Morning Post. About that time I had the great pleasure of meeting Mrs. E. M. Ward. The rencontre happened thus. The Misses Enid and Beatrice Ward, Mrs. Ward's youngest daughters, were getting up some theatricals, and, being short of a man, asked a lady with whom I was acquainted if she knew of anyone who would help them out of the difficulty. She wrote to me, with the result that I took part in the play, and thus had the good fortune to meet the Wards, with whom I am happy to say I have kept in touch ever since. A year or so afterwards I edited Mrs. Ward's Reminiscences, which was, almost without exception, well received by the press. Some papers, Vanity Fair and the Weekly Graphic, for instance, the Graphic has always been very kind and fair to me, giving the book several lengthy and highly eulogistic notices. Mrs. Ward is a believer in ghosts, and in her Reminiscences there is a very interesting first-hand experience of hers with the superphysical. Mrs. Ward's children, apart from the fact that they inherit talent from their mother and father, and grandfather, their great-grandfather, James Ward, R.A., and their great-great-uncle, George Morland, R.A., are very interesting in themselves and possess exceptional personal attractions. A week after I first visited their house, I was commissioned by the editor of The Weekly Dispatch, Mr. Bewley, to write a series of ghostly experiences for that paper. In order to do this, I made pilgrimages to all parts of the country, and in my zeal to find ghosts, occasionally encountered objects of a very different nature. On one occasion, in Brighton, I had taken advantage of a slightly open window to enter a tiny house I had been told was very badly haunted. It was a very dark night, and being unable to find my matches, I had to grope my way about. I was in a room with apparently never-ending walls. They seemed to go round and round without any outlet at all. At last, however, I managed to discover a doorway, and, passing through it, I felt my way to a staircase which I climbed up till I came to what I judged to be a landing. There all further speculations were brought to an abrupt end by my suddenly falling over some large, soft object on the floor. In an instant there was a loud yell, and I found myself rolling over and over, clawing and clutching at some foul and unsavoury mass that seemed to have fastened itself onto me with the intention of first probing out my eyes and then throttling me. The small flask of whiskey that I happened to have on me undoubtedly saved me from total annihilation. The moment the claw-like hands touched the flask, I was free. I staggered to my feet, searched again, and this time, fortunately found the matchbox and struck a light. Crouching on the floor in front of me was a long, thin, scraggy creature with an absolutely bloodless face and two big, round, protruding black eyes. Its hair was matted like a mop and tossed about anywhere. Its clothes, or rather rags, were buttonless, and only held together, here and there, by pieces of filthy string. A more disgusting, and at the same time pitiable, spectacle could not be imagined. It was fortunate for me that I had had previous experience of such sights in the parks and commons of London, otherwise I should have been terrified out of my wits. As it was, I only just managed to pull myself together, and realizing that what I saw before me was not a ghost, but a material and now, as far as I was concerned, harmless being, I spoke to it. "Well," I said, "at any rate you seem to like my whisky. How long have you been here?" The flask was gradually lowered, and a voice, which I decided was that of a woman, for up to the present I hadn't been able to decipher its sex, gurgled, "I sleep here every night. This is my house." "Then the enigma is solved," I said. "You are the ghost." "I soon shall be," the creature replied, "for I've eaten nothing for more than 2 days." "Well, I'm afraid I cannot give you any more than this," I said, "for it's all I have with me," and I handed her some biscuits and bread and cheese. Never shall I forget the savage joy with which she snatched the food from my hand and crammed it into her big, gaping, fleshless jaws. No animal in the zoo was half so voracious. When she had finished it all and drained the last drop of whisky, she drew her lean and dirty, albeit well-shaped, fingers across her mouth and cursed me. "Get you gone," she snarled, "and leave me here. I tell you this is my house. I've as much right to it as you or anyone else. Get you gone, or I'll spit at you." And not wishing to be spat upon, I picked up my flask and departed. I encountered another ghost of this order 3 nights later in a house in Manchester. The house was furnished, but was untenanted, as the owner, a rich and eccentric old lady, believed it to be haunted. She wrote to me, apropos of my book, Ghostly Phenomena, and suggested I should try and exorcise the ghost. Now, I do not altogether believe in exorcism. There are occasions upon which it has been practised with success, mostly in cases of haunting by phantasms of the sane dead, but there are also many cases, within my own experience, in which it has been practised with no result whatever. At all events, with my elastic views regarding denominational religion, I did not feel disposed to try it, and so I wrote and told her. She replied, "Come in any case, and give me your opinion as to the nature and cause of the phenomena." I went. The house was in a quiet, sleepy thoroughfare, not 3 minutes' walk from the Whalley Road. It was big and roomy, and would have been attractive but for the walls, the papers of which had obviously been chosen by someone who did not possess even the most elementary conception of what is pleasing in colour and design. As it was, my artistic susceptibilities were so grossly outraged that I could well have imagined the place haunted by neutrarians of the most undesirable order. I visited the house in the early evening, and the subdued light from the fast-fading sunshine, fading through the drawn Venetian blinds, produced a singularly sad, and at the same time ghostly effect. I had come unaccompanied, for nothing on earth would persuade the old lady or any of her domestics to set a foot in the house, and as I wandered through room after room, the intense hush began at length to tell on my nerves. When I was on the staircase leading to the top story, I fancied I heard a slight noise, and a sudden faintness coming over me. I had to clutch hold of the banisters to prevent myself falling. I went on, however, and opening a door at the top of the stairs, found myself in a large room communicating with 2 other rooms by means of doors, both of which stood slightly ajar. I had passed through the first, and was half across the floor of the second, when I suddenly felt one of my ankles caught hold of. The shock was so great that all the blood in my body seemed suddenly to dry up, and again I all but fainted. Forcing myself to look down, however, I perceived a skinny hand and arm protruding from under the dressing table, and assured by the appearance of it that it belonged to nothing ghostly, I struck at it with my stick, kicking out vigorously at the same time. With terrible howlings there now crawled from under the table a long and lanky idiot boy. It transpired that he was the son of one of the old lady's servants, and that he was enjoying a nice, comfortable home at her expense. His mother used to visit him every evening, and this evening he had hidden under the table with the intention of frightening her. Unfortunately for them both, however, he had frightened me instead. The servant, of course, lost her post, and the old lady, assured that there was no longer any fear of ghosts, came back to the house, and, at my suggestion, had all the walls repapered. The following week I had another rather strange experience in Liverpool. I was getting dozens of letters weekly at that time, as the first of my series of ghost stories had appeared in the Weekly Dispatch, and my fame as a spook hunter had spread far and wide in consequence. A lady in Liverpool wrote to me, saying that her daughter, Emily, was tormented by a man coming into her bedroom every night at the same time and walking off with her bedclothes. He said nothing, merely opened her door, and approaching the bed on tiptoe, caught hold of the clothes and hurriedly retreated with them. Spirit lights, my correspondent added, were constantly seen in the room, and at times figures like angels, and she would be glad if I would visit the house and discover for her, if possible, some explanation of the occurrences. The nature of the manifestations being somewhat extraordinary, I thought it discreet to take a friend. The house was in a crescent close to Clayton Square. We were shown into the drawing-room, where all the family were assembled, and we were at once regaled with detailed accounts of all that was alleged to happen. Then we were taken to the bedroom that was haunted, and the young lady whose bed the ghost stripped, at our request, sat there with us. As soon as the electric light was switched off, she began to see spirit lights. We saw nothing. No man appeared, and on taking our departure, we both agreed that the phenomena were subjective, and that it was simply a case of hallucination. Accordingly, I advised her mother to consult a good general practitioner, as, in all probability, her daughter needed a tonic and change of air. I strongly warned her against consulting any professional spiritualist. Well, I returned to London, and thought no more of the matter till the following Christmas, when, quite by chance, I ran against a young doctor, to whom I had mentioned the incident. Evidently eager to communicate something, he remarked, "You remember that Liverpool case you told me about, the case of the young lady whose bedclothes used to disappear, and which you thought was hallucination? Well, you were mistaken. Since I saw you, I have become acquainted with the doctor who attends her, and he told me that, whilst he was there one day, the bedroom door opened and in walked a young man. He says the girl immediately exclaimed, 'Here is the man who haunts my room at night. For goodness sake, doctor, do something.' Whereupon the man, muttering some words in German, abruptly left the room. My doctor friend immediately ran after him, but he was nowhere to be seen, and although the house was at once searched, no traces of him could be found. Now, what do you think of the case?" "It is certainly a very unusual one," I replied, "and as you say, this sequel quite upsets my theory of hallucination. It may be a case of projection. Someone who knows the girl and wishes to torment her is experimenting in visiting her in his immaterial ego. I have heard of similar cases." "But she knows no one like him," my friend responded. Probably not, I said. The image she sees may be, and very likely is, merely an assumed one. Does she know any Indians, or anyone who is an earnest student of the occult? Find out if you can. I have not yet heard from my friend, but I still incline to the idea that the ghost in this case was a phantasm of the living rather than a phantasm of the dead. End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 15. Some Strange Cases in Birmingham, Harrogate, Sussex, and Newcastle. Whilst I was still writing for the Weekly Dispatch, I happened to visit an old friend of mine, a Captain Rupert Tennyson, who was staying with an aged relative in the Hagley Road, Birmingham. "This is hardly the house you would expect to see a ghost in, is it?" he remarked to me after luncheon. "And yet I can assure you I had a very remarkable psychic experience here, in this very room. I've often wanted to tell you about it. It happened one New Year's Eve 3.5 years ago. My aunt had a nephew on her husband's side called Jack Wilmot, and he and I used to meet here regularly at the commencement of every new year. On this occasion, however, my aunt informed me that Wilmot was unable to be present, as he was detained in Mexico, where he had a very good post as a mining engineer. I was much disappointed, for Wilmot and I were great pals, and the prospect of staying here alone with the old lady struck me as perfectly appalling. I resolved to make the best of it, however, for I was genuinely sorry for my aunt, whom I could see was quite as disappointed as I was. I arrived late in the afternoon of December 31st. We dined at 7, and at 9 my aunt went off to bed and left me in this room by myself. For some time I read, no, not one of your books, O'Donnell, a Guy Maupassant. But the light being rather bad, and my eyes tired, for I had been travelling all the previous night, I was at last obliged to desist and devote myself entirely to a pipe. The servants went to bed at about 10. I heard them tap respectfully at my aunt's door on their way and wish her good night. After that the house was absolutely silent, so silent, indeed, that the hush began to get on my nerves, and I was contemplating retiring also, when heavy footsteps suddenly crossed the hall and the door of this room was flung wide open. I looked round in amazement. Standing on the threshold was Wilmot. "Why, Jack," I cried, "I am glad to see you, old fellow. Your aunt told me you could not come. How did you manage it?" "Quite easily," he said in the light, careless manner which was one of his characteristics. "Where there's a will, there's a way, you know. I've taken French leave." "Taken French leave!" I ejaculated. "Then there'll be the deuce to pay when you get back. Anyhow, that's your affair, not mine. You'll have some supper?" "No," he said. "I had a very good meal a short time ago, and I'm not the least bit hungry. We will chat instead." He pulled his chair up to the table and, leaning his elbows on it, stared right into my face. "You don't look very well, Jack," I said. "Maybe this strong light has something to do with it, but you are as pale as a sheet. Is it the voyage?" "Not altogether," he replied. "I've had a lot of trouble lately." "Tell me," I said. "Won't it bore you?" he replied. "After all, why should I bother other people with my woes?" "Oh, all right, I will if you like." "Some months ago there came to the town where I am working a wealthy Spaniard and his wife. Their name was Herveda. He was a tall, lean, sour-faced old curmudgeon, and she one of the most beautiful young creatures you can imagine. You can guess what happened?" "You fell in love with her, of course," I cried. "From the moment I saw her," Jack replied. You got introduced," I said. "Trust me," he laughed. "I found out where she lived, and the rest was so easy that before the end of the week I had dined with them and also had had one clandestine meeting in the park. At first her old villain of a husband suspected nothing. But it is infernally hard to keep up a pretense for long, when one is really madly consumed with passion. Eyes are sure indicators of what the heart feels, or at least mine are, and when Herveda suddenly looked up and caught me gazing at his wife as if I could devour her, the cat was completely out of the bag. I give him credit for one thing, however. He took it very calmly. Despite his unprepossessing exterior, he could at times be extremely courteous and dignified. "You will oblige me by settling this matter in the way customary to gentlemen in this country," he said. "You must remember you are not in England now. You are in Mexico. Have you a revolver?" "I am never without one," I replied. "Then," he observed, ignoring the intervention of his wife, whose apprehensions were only too plainly more on my account than on his, "we will step on to the veranda." "What?" I said. "You don't mean to say you actually fought a duel?" Jack nodded. "Yes," he said. "We measured off 20 paces and then, turning round, fired." "And you killed him?" "That would be your natural surmise," was the reply. "But you are mistaken. It was I who was killed." The moment he had said these words he seemed to fade away, and before I could recover from my astonishment, he had completely disappeared, and I found myself staring not at him but the blank wall. And now comes the oddest part of it. I naturally expected to hear Jack was dead. I said nothing to my aunt, but I wrote off to his address at once. Judge then of my relief when I received a letter from him by return of post to say he was absolutely fit and well, and getting on splendidly. That was in February. In the following August my aunt wrote to me saying a very tragic occurrence had taken place. Jack was dead. He had been found on the veranda of an hotel in Mexico shot through the heart. Though the identity of his murderer was generally suspected, there was no actual proof, and as the man was very rich and influential, it was thought quite useless to take up the case. Now, what kind of superphysical phenomenon do you call that? Captain Tennyson concluded. "I can't exactly say," I replied. "It is one of those strange prognostications of the future that happen more often on New Year's Eve than on any other day of the year. I don't think the phantasm you saw was actually Wilmot's spirit. I don't see how it could have been. I think it was an impersonating neutrarian, one of that order of phantasms that have never inhabited any kind of material body, and whose special function is apparently to foretell the end of certain people, and certain people only." When I had finished my articles for the Weekly Dispatch, which I was writing in alternation with The Reminiscences of Mrs. E. M. Ward, I took a brief holiday, visiting for the first time Matlock and Harrogate. Learning that there was an alleged haunted house in the latter town, I sought, and managed to obtain, permission to spend a night in it. It was a modern edifice of a great height, situated about 10 minutes' walk from St. James's Hall. I went there alone, and, on entering the premises, encountered an almost death-like air of stillness, which contrasted oddly with the world outside, where all was life and gaiety. But a moment before I had mixed with the streams of ultra-fashionable people heading for the Spa concert, the theatre, and the Valley Park, and, so free had they seemed from all trouble and responsibility, so full of sparkling, spontaneous fun and flippancy, and above all, so full of the flamboyant spirit of sheer life, that one could not help feeling, as one looked at them, that after all there could be no such thing as death for them, that such pronounced vitality must go on forever. But this house, This forsaken house, void of furniture, of everything, save the soft summer evening sunlight, the shadows, and my presence, how different! Wandering from room to room and floor to floor, I at length completed my preliminary search, and being somewhat tired, I sat down on the floor of the hall, and, taking a newspaper from my pocket, I started reading. As the hours passed by and darkness came on, I began to be afraid. No amount of experience in ghost hunting will ever enable me to overcome that awful, hideous fear that seizes me when I see the last glimmer of daylight fade, and I realize I am about to be brought into contact with the superphysical, and that I must face it alone. Noises in empty houses, I have noticed, usually commence in the basement, and I was not at all surprised when presently I heard a faint tapping proceeding from one of the kitchens. This was followed by a long spell of silence, and then one of the stairs creaked. My heart gave a big thump, and I gazed expectantly into the darkness before me, but there was nothing to be seen. Silence again, and then more tapping and more creaking. Something then tickled my hand, and a moment later my fingers touched a black beetle. In an instant I was on my feet, for I dread beetles more than I dread ghosts, and, on my striking a light, I found the whole floor swarming. I wondered very much at this, because beetles do not as a rule frequent houses that have been empty for any length of time, especially in a climate like that of Harrogate. I have since, however, arrived at the conclusion that where there are hauntings, there are, more often than not, plagues of beetles, but whether attracted by the ghost or not, I cannot say. As I could no longer tolerate the idea of remaining in the hall in the dark, I lighted 4 candles, and, placing them on the floor, sat in the midst of them. It was only 11 o'clock by my watch, and the idea of keeping up my vigil till the morning did not strike me as particularly pleasant. I took up my paper and again began to read. Half an hour or so passed, and then I received a start. A door opened and shut downstairs, and bare footsteps pattered their way along the stone passage and up the wooden stairs. The nearer they drew, the more intolerable became my suspense. What should I see? A white-faced, glassy-eyed phantasm of the dead? Or some blood-curdling, semi-human, semi-animal neutrarian? Which would it be? I confess I would have given all I possessed to be out in the road, but as is usually the case with me when in the presence of the superphysical, I was quite powerless to speak or move. Then, to my unfeigned astonishment, instead of anything grotesque and awful, there appeared before me a little fair-haired girl, clad in a much-soiled pinafore, and without either shoes or stockings. Though not actually crying, she appeared in great distress, and feeling around on all sides, as if anxiously searching for someone, she ran past me and commenced to ascend the stairs. Picking up a candle, I followed her, and as the patterings of her poor, chilled feet spread their echoes far and wide through the vast deserted house, I thought I had never experienced anything half so pathetic. On and on we went, the little thin legs leading the way, till we reached the top story, where she ran into a room facing me and slammed the door. I immediately followed, but the room was quite empty. There were no signs of the child. There were only a particularly vivid beam of moonlight and a virile and overwhelming atmosphere of sadness. During the next few days I was told a story that fully accounted for the hauntings. It appears that about 30 years before my visit to the house, a little girl had lived there with her father and stepmother. Her nurse, to whom she was very much attached, being summarily dismissed by her stepmother, she became ill and very soon died, so it was rumored, of a broken heart. Shortly after her death the house was to let, and no tenant, I found out, has ever occupied it since for very long. I have often wished that I had spoken to the sad little spirit, but I was too fascinated by it, and too much engaged watching its movements, to think of anything else. I have found that this same fascination and preoccupation have prevented me from trying to communicate with the ghost in nearly all the cases of haunting that I have ever investigated. On the few occasions that I have spoken to a phantasm, I have received no reply, no indication even that it has heard me. In a very famous haunted house in the west of England, during my investigations, which were spread over a period of 9 not uninterruptedly consecutive nights, manifestations took place twice, and on both occasions I stood up and spoke, but in neither case was there any response whatever. This same ghost had been subjected to exorcism by a well-known ecclesiast, but far from being exorcised, the ghost so scared his exorciser that he all but fainted. These demonstrations were visual. In a haunted house that I was asked to visit in Sussex, I saw nothing but heard knockings, and by means of them tried, though without success, to establish a code. I heard of the case in this way. A young lady whom I will call Miss Hemming wrote to me. She and her mother occupied a modern and picturesquely situated house at the foot of the Downs, and were very frequently disturbed, she said, between 9 and 10 in the evening, by sounds such as might be made with a muffled hammer on the wall of her mother's room. Simultaneously, the figure of a young man moved noiselessly across the lawn from the direction of a swing. He usually approached her window and came to a halt immediately beneath it. He had never replied when spoken to. She had fired at him several times, but the bullets had had no effect whatever. It seemed as if they had passed right through him, because he still stood there, whilst the gravel was splattered up immediately behind him. On 1 or 2 occasions he shone a bicycle lamp on his face, so that she could distinctly see his features. It was the face of no one she knew, though she fancied it bore a close resemblance to a notorious murderer whose photos had been in the papers, and who had expiated his crime on the gallows. These were not the only manifestations. Stones had been repeatedly thrown at Mrs. Hemming, and although the house was being closely watched by the police, the stone throwing still went on, and so far the culprit has not even been seen, let alone caught. I visited the house once by myself, and once with a party of men. On the former occasion I hid in a little copse at the furthest extremity of the lawn, and watched the house and swing closely, but I neither heard nor saw anything. Returning to the house, I was told by Miss Hemming that both she and her mother had heard the knockings, and that she herself had, at the same time, seen the figure on the lawn. On the occasion of my second visit, we all heard the knockings on the wall of Mrs. Hemming's room, and one of us, who was looking out of her daughter's window, saw what he fancied were 2 shadows of human beings cross the moonlit lawn and vanish in the direction of a hedge. Trickery was practically impossible, as the garden was protected on all sides by barbed wire, and there were on the premises 4 or 5 dogs, including a young bloodhound. We had, of course, made a thorough search of the house and grounds previously. 1 or 2 other incidents happened during the night. When I was in the hall, alone, a light, as from a bicycle lamp, was suddenly shown in my face, apparently from a blank wall, and when we were all seated in front of the dining-room fire, we heard heavy footsteps cross the hall, and although we ran out at once, we could see no one. We were shown the stones that were alleged to have been thrown, but none were thrown whilst we were there. They were a peculiar kind of flint, which certainly did not belong to the neighborhood. Mrs. Hemming had several times narrowly escaped being hit by them, and one had crashed through the bedroom window as she was looking out of it. I did not continue my investigation of the case, because there were certain features in connection with it of a private and family nature, which greatly added to its complexity and which would of necessity have rendered any attempt at solution incomplete and unsatisfactory. Cases of complex haunting, although for obvious reasons seldom admitting of any satisfactory explanation, always interest me the most. Here is one I chanced to hit upon in Newcastle. A house on one street had stood empty for 7 or 8 years, and on my making inquiries about it, I was told to apply to a Mr. Black, the last tenant. I did so, and Mr. Black very kindly gave me a detailed account of what had taken place there during his tenancy. It was as follows. A day or two after our arrival, I happened to be going upstairs, and as I passed by one of the bedrooms, the door of which was slightly open, I glanced in and saw the figure of a lady whom I had never seen before. She was dressed in green and standing in front of the looking-glass, engaged apparently in putting on her hat. Wondering who on earth she could be, for I knew the room had not been slept in, I spoke to her, and, receiving no reply, I was advancing towards her when she suddenly disappeared. I did not know what to make of the affair, but, thinking that possibly it was an hallucination, I resolved to think no more of it, and to say nothing about it to any of my family or household. Some days later, however, when out walking with my wife, I met a friend who asked me where I was living. I told him, and he exclaimed excitedly, "Good gracious, not in that house! Why, my dear fellow—" At a sign from me, he stopped. I had guessed what was coming, and as my wife is extremely nervous, I thought it best she should not hear what I knew he was going to say, namely, that the house was haunted. That night I went round to see my friend. He made no bones about it. He told me that the house I had taken was haunted, that he knew it for a fact. "Some months ago," he said, "I was thinking of taking it myself, and, obtaining the key from the agent, went to look over it. It was quite light, not more than 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the house seemed bright and cheerful. Closing the front door carefully behind me, I commenced a tour of the premises. I had reached the top floor and was standing in the centre of one of the rooms, when I heard a slight noise. I started, and turning round in the direction from which the sound came, perceived a lady and a little girl standing in the doorway, watching me. There was nothing at all remarkable about them. The lady was dressed in green, the child in white, both modern, or at least comparatively modern, costumes. I was so surprised at their being there, however, as I knew I had shut the hall door, that I simply stood and stared at them. Then something much more extraordinary happened. They vanished. It was not an hallucination, that I can swear to, and thoroughly scared, I tore downstairs and out of the house. After this I gave up all idea of taking the place, and I can't help feeling sorry, old fellow, that you've taken it." In spite of this warning, Mr. Black continued, I did not give up the house immediately. After we had been there a week or so, a cousin of mine came to stay with us, and one evening he and one of my children, who were in the drawing-room, together heard a soft, cautious whistle, as if someone were giving a signal, coming, they thought, from just behind them. The whistle was repeated, and a few minutes later they heard a loud cry, half human, half animal, and wholly ominous. My cousin pretended it was one of the servants, but my child would not be convinced, and begged to be taken to bed at once, as she dared not remain in the room any longer. After this, phenomena of all kinds happened. Steps used to be heard bounding up and down the stairs at all hours of the night. One of the maids declared she saw something that was a man and yet not a man come out of the drawing-room with a run, and race up the staircase 2 or 3 steps at a time. Heavy pantings and sighs were heard, and several of the household were awakened by a cold hand being laid upon their face. But I think the most remarkable thing that happened is this. I was sitting in my study one evening when the maid rapped at my door and said that a clergyman, whom she had usually shown into the drawing-room, wished to see me on some very urgent matter. I at once put down the book I was reading, and hastening to the drawing-room, found it empty. Wondering what had become of the clergyman, I was about to ring the bell to inquire, when I suddenly caught sight of a large eye, human in shape and horribly sinister, glaring at me from behind an armchair. I was so frightened that I could do nothing but stare back at it, and then, to my intense relief, my wife entered the room with a friend, and the phenomenon disappeared. "And the parson?" I observed. "I never heard anything more of him," Mr. Black remarked. "The maid assured me on her honour that she had shown him into the room, but no one saw him leave the house, so he too might have been a ghost. But supposing him to have been a living person, his disappearance would not be unnatural. He had doubtless seen the eye and precipitated himself into the street through the open window. The following day, my children being badly frightened by something in one of the passages, I decided to leave the house, and although I afterwards made every possible enquiry, I could never hear of anything particularly tragic that had ever happened there. We were the first tenants, so I was told, that had ever complained of disturbances, and it was suggested that we might have brought the ghosts with us. But as none of us had ever seen a ghost before we entered that house, and we had no old furniture, at least none that we had not always had, and not one of us had ever attended a séance or in any way dabbled with spiritualism, I do not think that theory at all possible. How do you account for the hauntings?" "I cannot," I replied, "nor can anyone else. The sheer complexity of such a case renders any definite conclusion with regard to it extremely difficult, and any positive solution of it utterly out of the question." End of Chapter 15. Chapter 16 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 16. War Ghosts. Of late years, the increase of interest taken in things psychical, particularly among the more educated classes, the classes that were at one time incorrigibly skeptical, has been enormous. I believe this to be mainly due to the fact that people are no longer satisfied with the scriptural declaration of another world. They want proof of it, that is to say, absolutely authentic and corroborative evidence that it exists, and they feel that they can only obtain such evidence by witnessing superphysical manifestations themselves. Psychical research societies, perhaps, convince them even less than the Bible. And naturally, for the scientist, even though he be titled, can hardly hope to accomplish in one generation what theologians, of an equal if not superior intelligence, have attempted and failed to accomplish throughout the ages. Hence, I am of the opinion that one can learn more from one spontaneous ghostly manifestation in a haunted house than from 1,000 lectures or 1,000 books. Experience is the only medium of conviction, and so long as people are without a personal experience relating to another world, they can never really believe. The boy in rags and tatters may be far more conversant with, may know far more about, a future life than the more learned professor at the university. But no one can logically claim to be an absolute authority on the unknown. The most any of us can do, even those of us who have actually seen and heard spirit manifestations, the rest do not count, is to speculate. When we attempt to do more, we label ourselves fools. Of all the professions, none, I believe, is more interested in this question of another world than the theatrical. I have a great many friends amongst actors and actresses, and I find them not only keenly interested in my work, but always ready, even when working hard themselves, to share my vigils in a haunted house. Only the other day, at a concert given by the Irish Literary Society in Hanover Square, I was introduced to Miss Odette Goimbolt, who recently delighted London audiences by her impersonation of the child Doris in On Trial at the Lyric Theatre. Odette Goimbolt is unquestionably pretty, but there is much in her looks besides mere prettiness. She has eyes that are extraordinarily spiritual, eyes that seem to look right into the soul of things, and see things that are not generally seen by ordinary mortals. When a very small child, Odette Goimbolt lived with her mother in a house at Thornton Heath. A lady died of consumption in the flat immediately beneath Mrs. Goimbolt's, and after the burial, Odette, though previously very fond of staying up late, used every night, precisely at 7 o'clock, to beg her mother to take her upstairs to bed, declaring, in a great state of terror and with tears in her eyes, that she saw an old man with only one leg standing in a corner of the room, shaking his stick at her. When once she was taken out of the room, her fears subsided. In my opinion, she is an ideal young actress for the portrayal of soul, for the transmittal of a sense of soul to the audience, and I think there is no one, either on the stage or off it, who looks more in touch with the spiritual world than Odette Goimbolt. But stronger even than its hold upon the theatrical profession is the stand that psychism has taken with regard to the present war. Ever since the fighting began, I have heard speculations raised as to whether our soldiers at the front have been witnessing ghostly manifestations or not. So far, I must own that I have elicited very little reliable evidence on this point. But the circumstances have established at least one interesting fact, and that is, that to the man in the street, the question of another world has at last become a matter of some importance. The wife of a very eminent official at the War Office told me a few weeks ago that officers who took part in the Dardanelles expedition assured her that figures believed to be ghosts were on several occasions seen gliding over the ground after an engagement, especially where the dead bodies of the Turks lay thickest. The same lady also told me that when a certain regiment formed up after a brilliant charge, in which it had suffered very severe casualties, some of the gaps in the ranks were observed to be filled by shadowy forms which disappeared the moment anyone attempted to touch them. Neither my informant nor any of the soldiers from the front that I have met have been able to give me any information as to the alleged superphysical demonstrations in the sky during the retreat from Mons. But I should like to record here, in connection with the war, a case I heard in Paris. I published an account of it in the November 1915 number of The Occult Review, and now reproduce it through the courtesy of Mr. Ralph Shirley. The mention of Ferdinand of Bulgaria brings vividly back to my memory two stories I heard about him, when I was dining one evening in June 1914 at the renowned Henriette's restaurant in Montparnasse. Two men were seated at a table close beside me, and I eventually got into conversation with them. They informed me they were journalists, and that their names were Guilgaud and Bonivon, respectively. "You would laugh if you knew where I spent last night," I observed. "I was in an alleged haunted flat in Montrouge. I don't suppose either of you believes in ghosts?" "I do," Guilgaud said. "I have had more than one experience with an apparition in my life, and so has my friend." "Yes," chimed in Bonivon. "We have good cause to remember ghosts, since we stayed 6 weeks in a haunted hotel in Bucharest, and never had such an infernally uncomfortable time either, before or since. We never saw the ghost ourselves, but one of the other lodgers declared he did, and used to wake us every other night by the most unholy screams. They then talked a lot about their adventures in the Balkans, and finally alluded to Ferdinand of Bulgaria. "If ever a man is haunted, he is," Gilgo remarked. "I believe he never leaves his room at night without the shadow of Stambuloff, whose death he brought about in 1895. It simply steps out from the wall and follows him." "That is a lot of exaggeration," Bonivon said with a laugh. "But quite seriously, we heard on very excellent authority that on more than one occasion a figure has been seen accompanying Ferdinand, sometimes when dining and sometimes when walking, and that it has been recognized by the spectators as Stambuloff, the dead minister. Once, we were told, Ferdinand visited a certain princess, and it was remarked that Her Royal Highness appeared strangely embarrassed and perturbed. At last someone ventured to inquire of the lady in waiting, who also appeared to be greatly perturbed, what was the matter. "It's that man," was the whispered reply. "That man who persists in standing beside His Majesty. He never takes his eyes from our faces, and he looks just like a corpse." Her interrogator asked her to describe the figure, which he said was quite invisible to him. She did so, and the description tallied exactly with that of Stambuloff. "Tell him about Ferdinand and the fortune-teller," Gilgo said. "Yes, that happened when we were staying close to his Coherie estates," Bonivon responded. "Ferdinand is notoriously sly and mean, and one day, as he was passing through the village where we were staying, he chanced to encounter a charming Hungarian maiden, who eked out a very precarious livelihood hawking ribbons and telling fortunes. Ferdinand had his hand read, and thinking to trap the girl, disguised himself and went to her again the following evening. To his astonishment, although the make-up was skillful, for Ferdinand is a born actor in more senses than one, the girl recognized him at once as the gentleman who had been to her the previous evening. "I was expecting you," she said. "Expecting me?" Ferdinand stammered. "How is that? I've told no one." "Oh, fie," the girl remonstrated, shaking her finger at him. "The gentleman who accompanied you last night came here himself an hour ago and told me you were coming." "What was he like?" Ferdinand asked, shaking all over. "Like," the girl retorted pertly. "Why, you know as well as I do," and she rattled off a description of the man, which tallied exactly with that of the dead Stambuloff, whom, by the way, Gilgo and I had seen many scores of times in the early '80s. "Your friend," the girl continued, "left a message for you. He said, 'Tell him when he comes that he will perish in very much the same manner as I have done.' And he showed me his hand." "And what did you see?" Ferdinand asked. "I saw the same ending to the lifeline in his hand as I see in yours," the girl replied. "Why, there is your friend. He is beckoning to you. You had better go to him." And, to her astonishment, Ferdinand walked off in the opposite direction. We had the story first hand. She told us 2 or 3 days afterwards, and expressed great anxiety as to the identity of the 2 men who had behaved so strangely to her. Only one case of haunting at the actual front has been related to me. I will state it in my own words. It happened during the retreat. The regiment had suffered heavily, and in the scramble to get out of the deadly fire zone, small parties of them, owing to the nature of the country, had got isolated from the main body and left behind. This was the case with a dozen or so men of B Company, who, after racing across a field amid a hail of shrapnel, had clambered over a formidable barrier of barbed wire into a dense wood. Under cover of a thick cluster of trees they sat down and doctored their wounds. There was not a sound man amongst them. Sergeant Mackay had been struck in 3 places in his right leg. Corporal McIntyre had had a good square inch of flesh taken off his thigh. Private Finlay had lost 3 of his fingers, and Bugler Scott an ear, while in addition to these slight inconveniences, they were all ravenously hungry and parched with thirst. "I suggest," said Sergeant Mackay, after a brief lull in their conversation, "that we push on again and see if we can find some sort of habitation where we can get a mouthful." "Aye, mon," Corporal McIntyre replied, for during such sauve-qui-peurs all formality of rank is dropped. "It's the wee drappie I'm thinking after, and unless we get some of it pretty soon, there'll not be any of us left to need it. I'm bleeding like a pig, and so are a good many more of us." "Very well, then," Sergeant Mackay observed, rising with difficulty, and wincing in spite of his efforts to appear comfortable. "Let us press on." The men were all absolutely ignorant of their surroundings. They had seen nothing of the country save from the train, and during a few hours' tramp from the railway depot to the lines they had just evacuated. Consequently, for all they knew to the contrary, the wood that lay in front of them might stretch for miles, or might be inhabited by anything from grizzly bears to hyenas, for the knowledge of the British Tommy with regard to the fauna and flora of Belgium is extremely limited. Threading their way through the thick undergrowth, they stole stealthily forward, the roar of artillery still sounding faintly in their ears, till at length they emerged into a wide clearing, at the far extremity of which stood a neatly thatched white cottage. It was so homelike with its small plot of flower-bedecked garden, its walls covered with clematis and honeysuckle, and its tiny spiral column of smoke curling heavenwards, that the bleeding and exhausted men gave deep sighs of relief. "Reminds me of Scotland," Private Finlay whispered. "It's as like my mother's cottage as 2 peas," Private Callum retorted. They halted and were looking at Sergeant Mackay to see what he would do, for bold as the regiments are in battle, they are often among the most bashful of His Majesty's troops in times of peace, when suddenly the door of the cottage opened and an old woman appeared on the threshold, armed with a blunderbuss. Glaring fiercely and shouting, she put the weapon to her hip and fired. There was a loud bang, and 1 or 2 of the men uttered ejaculations of pain. "God save us!" Sergeant Mackay cried. "The good wife takes us for the Germans." Then addressing the woman, who was pouring another handful of shot into the muzzle of her infernal piece of antiquity, he called out, "Are ye daft or glaikit? Dinna ken that we are Scots? Anglais!" It was the only word of French the Highlander knew, and on shouting it 3 times in succession, and with increased emphasis, it had effect. The old woman lowered her weapon, and shading her eyes with a lean, brown, and knotted hand, exclaimed, "Oh, mon Dieu, les Anglais! On me dit que les Anglais sont les amis de Belgique, et je vous aurais tué. Pardonnez-moi, messieurs." This speech was of course lost upon the Highlanders, who would have laughed, so comic was the picture of this old woman with the ancient gun, had they not been faint from exhaustion. Now, as she beckoned to them to approach, they doffed their caps and filed in at her gate, Sergeant Mackay leading the way. The interior of the house was as they had expected, scrupulously neat and clean. "Wipe your boots, boys," Sergeant Mackay whispered. "We mustn't put the old lady out more than we can help." They all trooped in. As soon as they were seated, the old woman vanished through a low doorway, reappearing a few seconds later, laden with bread and cheese and wine, which she watched them eat and drink with perfect satisfaction, and when they had finished, conducted them to a loft at the back of the cottage, where she made them understand by signs they could lie as long as they pleased. "I kinna think," Sergeant Mackay said, as soon as their hostess had retired, "where the Germans are. It's passing strange they have not put in an appearance here." Maybe they've gone by and missed this spot. It's nae so handy, Private Finlay said. Anyhow, I'm for sleeping, for it's 10 days since I shut my eyes. It's the same with me, ejaculated Private McCallum. I had not slept a wink since we left Plymouth. Apparently they were all of the same opinion, namely that they needed rest, and, without further ado, every man selected a place in the hay, stretched himself out at full length, and was soon fast asleep. The afternoon wore away, the sun set, and one by one the stars made their appearance, but still the men slept. The gloom of the forest thickened, and with the long and waving shadows of the elms and beeches crept forth forms of a more tangible and sinister nature. Sergeant Mackay awoke with a start, and springing to his feet, strained his ears and listened. "Nightmare," he said. "I made certain the Germans had got hold of me. Weel, it's naught but a dream. I will go and see what the goodwife is about, and perhaps, if she had not gone to bed, she will give us some hot tea or milk. That red wine of hers have made me uncommon thirsty." He scrambled down on the ground, and leaving the rest of the men still asleep, crossed the yard and pushed open the door leading to the kitchen. He was about to enter, when there came a half-choking cry, and the front of the house filled with soldiers. Sergeant Mackay knew them at once. They were Germans. Shrinking back into the shadow of the doorway, he stood and listened. Though he could not understand their jargon, he soon formed an idea of what was taking place. They had caught the old woman by surprise and were discussing what they should do with her. Had the men been armed, Sergeant Mackay would not have hesitated. He would have staked anything on a win against odds at 6 to 1. But in their hasty flight the men had left their rifles behind them, and it would be sheer suicide for them to attack the Germans with their bare fists. Therefore it at once entered his mind to slip out quietly and warn his comrades, so that they could escape without their presence being detected. A cry of pain, however, made him hesitate. 2 Germans had hold of the old woman's arms and were twisting them round. The difficulty of his position was not lost on Sergeant Mackay. If he played the knight-errant and helped the old woman, he would not be able to give his comrades the necessary warning, and they would all be taken prisoners, perhaps shot. On the other hand, this goodwife had been extremely kind to them, and was proving her loyalty by maintaining an absolute silence as to their presence in the cottage. Could he stand by and see her abused? He could not. There was too much of the Gael in him for that, and as the old woman gave another gurgle, he stepped out from his hiding place and, picking up a kitchen chair, rushed at her captors, both of whom he stunned. He was, of course, eventually borne down by numbers and dragged to the ground. "What shall we do with him?" one of the men who were holding him asked. "The dog? He has broken Fritz's head, and more than half killed Hans. He has arms like a bullock." "Hang him," the sergeant in charge of the men replied. "Tie him and the old woman together and hang them from this beam." And he pointed to a great white rafter running across the ceiling. Sergeant Mackay's uniform should, of course, have protected him, but then, as the German sergeant put it, this cottage was well hidden in the woods. The English were evacuating the country, and no one was likely to come across the bodies, saving Belgian peasants who dare not say anything, and German soldiers who would not say anything. So Sergeant Mackay was dragged up from the floor, beaten and bruised till there was very little of him left, bound tightly to the old goodwife, and hanged with her. The Germans then ransacked the house, and were preparing to explore the outer premises, when a bugle rang out, and they hurriedly left the cottage. 10 minutes later, when all was quiet, into the house, on tiptoe, stole the rest of the men. "God save us!" ejaculated Private Finlay, starting back and pointing to the grim figures swaying gently from the ceiling. "God save us! Say what the devil's done!" "Halt!" The word of the colonel, transmitted by his adjutant, to the head of the column, brought the regiment to a dead stop. For this they were not altogether sorry, as they had been footing it for 8 or 9 hours on end, and every little respite was welcome. But the colonel in this instance at least was not intentionally a good Samaritan. He had halted, not for the purpose of resting his men, but because he was fogged as to his whereabouts. The night was inky black, the country difficult, all hills, deep depressions, and thick woods, and the colonel, relying implicitly on the guidance of his intelligence officer, whom he supposed had made himself thoroughly familiar with the locality, found himself obviously going astray. He should now be at a railway bridge which was 6 miles from the village of Etigny, the last landmark. But no such bridge, as far as he could judge, was anywhere near, and Lambert, the intelligence officer, on being questioned, admitted he did not exactly know where they were. That is why the colonel had halted. His object was to make a flank attack on the German outposts, who were supposed to be hiding in a wood, some 3 miles to the south, where the extreme right of their main army lay, and obviously it was of no use advancing any further until he had ascertained the direction in which he must steer. In this wood was a cottage that had been enlarged and fortified, and hitherto used as a place of interment and hospital for English prisoners, until they could be transported to Potsdam. Reports had reached the English CO that the Germans intended killing all their prisoners, if compelled to evacuate, and so the regiment were to endeavour to rescue these prisoners, whilst at the same time outflanking and cutting off the German outposts. The movement had, of course, to be in the nature of an entire surprise, and the hospital to be rushed, if possible, without any firing. According to Lambert, the wood was about 1 mile due east of the railway bridge, and there was a tiny path near a mill on the outskirts of it that led to the rear of the cottage. To miss this path would be dangerous, as the wood elsewhere was covered with morass and full of quarries. "Well, Lambert," the colonel said, "you have led us into a deuced rotten hole, and you must get us out of it somehow. Surely you have some idea of our whereabouts." Lambert peered again into the darkness and shook his head. "On a night like this," he argued, "it is easy to make mistakes. We must have come much further to the west than I intended." "Well, then, we had better veer round and make for the extreme east," the colonel said tartly. "Would it not be as well to return to Etigny, sir?" the adjutant suggested. "What, 6 miles? Lose all that time? And with our men already pretty well exhausted?" The colonel retorted angrily. "No, that is utterly out of the question. Lambert has brought us here, and, egad, he must take us on to our destination." Lambert took a few paces into the darkness and was again peering round, when a young lieutenant approached the colonel and saluted. "If you please, sir," he said, "a man has just arrived who says he will act as our guide." "A man? A German, I suppose you mean. What language does he speak?" "English, at least in part. He is a Scot. Shall I bring him to you?" The colonel gave a gruff assent, and in a few minutes the subaltern returned, followed by a tall figure enveloped in a long black cloak. With one accord the colonel, the adjutant, and Lambert all swung round and eyed him curiously. "Who and what are you?" demanded the colonel. "I am an inhabitant of these parts," the stranger answered, "and I have come to offer you my services as a guide." "You're in the pay of the Germans, of course," the colonel retorted sharply. "How did you know we wanted a guide?" "I overheard your conversation." "What?" the colonel cried furiously. "You have been listening to what we were saying. Take him away, Anderson, and have him shot at once." No one moved. A sort of spell stole over Lambert, the adjutant, and Anderson, and held them rooted to the ground. The colonel repeated his order, and was about to lay hands on the stranger himself when the latter waved him back. "In an emergency like this, Colonel," he said, "you must take what Providence sends you. I am no more a German spy than is your son Alec, who is probably, at the present moment, returning from an afternoon's march out with the OTC at Cheltenham." "Great heavens!" the colonel gasped. "How do you know I have a son, Alec, and that he is at Cheltenham? Who are you, sir? A renegade?" "No, Colonel, I am not," came the reply. "I'm someone in whom you can place perfect confidence. Trust yourself to me, and I will conduct you at once to the cottage in the wood." "It's very extraordinary. I don't for the life of me know what to make of it," the colonel muttered, turning to the group of officers by his side. "What do you advise, Lambert?" "Under the circumstances, sir," Lambert replied slowly, "I should trust him. You can have him shot if he leads us wrong." "That's true," the colonel murmured, and turning to the stranger, "Did you hear what Major Lambert said? I can have you shot if you lead us astray, and by Jove, I will. Take your position at the head of the column. If we are successful, I will see that you are adequately rewarded. If you betray us, you die. Do you understand?" "I do, Colonel," the stranger replied, "and I accept your conditions willingly." He stepped back and at a signal from the colonel followed Lieutenant Anderson to the head of the column. A sergeant and a corporal, two old and tried veterans, took up their positions a pace or two behind him, and at a word from the colonel the whole battalion was once more on the move. On and on they went. A dull tramp, 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 but in a completely different direction from the one in which they had previously been going. It was all so pitch dark that the corporal and the sergeant had to keep very close to the stranger to see him. "He marches just like one of us," the sergeant whispered, "and yet I can hear the sound of his feet. What do you make of him?" "I don't know," the corporal replied. "I seem to know him, and yet I haven't seen a feature of his face. Something about him reminds me of the night I escaped. It strikes me, Sergeant, that the cottage the colonel is after is the very one in which we took shelter." "Then you know the way?" "Nay," Corporal Findlay replied. "I was too rushed and scared that night to remember much. The only thing I can remember seeing plainly is those two corpses swinging from the beam, Sergeant Mackay's and the good wife's, and the scene comes back to me vividly now as I look at this guide of ours. Why, I dinna ken." "Be ready to shoot him, mon, the instant there's treachery," the sergeant whispered. "Aye, aye," Corporal Findlay replied, tapping the barrel of his rifle knowingly. "He'll nae want a second dose." On and on they tramped, till presently they forsook the highway for a field, and then, plunging down and down, eventually found themselves upon level ground facing some trees. "This is the wood," the guide observed, "and here is the path. After we have travelled along it in Indian file and on tiptoe for 2 miles, we shall emerge into a small clearing, where a low mud wall, overtopped by a machine gun, will confront us. The soldiers supposed to be on duty there have been drinking red wine all day, and are now sleeping. If you approach noiselessly, you will be able to climb the wall and take them by surprise. The cottage is then yours." "But there are sentries in the wood." "One. He will be leaning on his rifle dozing. You must creep up to him and settle him before he has time to make a sound. I will tell you when we approach him." The guide advanced, and the whole battalion stalked along behind him. "I shall be gay glad when this job is over," Corporal Findlay murmured. "I would as soon spend the night in a kirkyard." However, although every now and then a rustling of leaves that heralded a rabbit made them start, and the ominous screech of an owl caused the hair on the scalp of more than one superstitious Celt to bristle, so far there was no real cause for alarm, and on the battalion stole. At last their guide halted, and every man behind him instantly followed suit. He whispered to Corporal Findlay and the sergeant, and making way to let them pass, kept close to their heels, guiding them by what appeared to be a minute bull's-eye lantern. On turning a sharp bend in the path, Corporal Finlay and the sergeant saw the sentry, as their guide had described him, asleep, and before he had time to awake, Corporal Finlay had dashed him to the ground with a swinging blow from the butt end of his rifle. 3 minutes later, and the head of the column found itself facing the mud wall and the machine gun. This was the critical moment. If their guide meant mischief, now was his opportunity. Following closely at his heels, their rifle and revolver at his head, the sergeant and corporal crept up to the wall, and, one by one, the rest of the battalion filed into the open space after them. Holding their breath, the Highlanders laid hold of the top of the wall, and then, with a sudden stoop, they swung themselves upwards. The sleeping sentinels awoke, but only to feel one short, sharp thrust, and the pangs of death. The outer position won, the Highlanders next turned their attention to the cottage and the enclosed space in front of it. There a strong body of German infantry was stationed, and as they came rushing out to meet the intruders, they shared the same fate as their companions. In 10 minutes there was not a German left alive, and the battalion, their bayonets dripping with blood, were busy liberating the English prisoners. When it was all over, and the colonel and his staff were sitting down in the front parlour of the cottage enjoying some refreshment, the colonel suddenly remembered the guide. "Anderson," he said, "fetch that fellow, our guide, in here. It's not very gracious behaviour on our part to leave him outside, for, egad, if it had not been for him we should not be where we are. Moreover, I want to see him. I've an idea he's someone I know." The subaltern departed, and after an interval of some minutes returned, followed only by Corporal Finlay. "Hello!" exclaimed the colonel, looking up sharply from his meal. "This is not the man I wanted. Where is he?" "If you please, sir," the subaltern said, in a voice full of suppressed excitement, "Corporal Finlay can tell you all about it. He was the last to see him." "The last to see him?" growled the colonel. "Why, what the deuce do you mean? Where is he?" "I can't say, sir," Corporal Finlay began. "After the fight was over, I followed him into this cottage, right into this room, and he halted just where you are sitting, under that beam." And he pointed to the great white rafter immediately over the colonel's head. "He then turned round, sir, and drawing aside the cloak, that had hitherto hidden his face, showed himself to me." "Great God, man, you needn't look so frightened," the colonel cried. "He wasn't the devil, was he?" "No, sir, he wasn't the devil," Corporal Finlay responded. "He was Sergeant Mackay of the 1st Battalion, and the last time I had set eyes on him was in this room on the night of the retreat, when I and several others found him hanging from that rafter, dead." "And then," said the colonel, after a long pause, "and then what happened?" "Why, sir," Corporal Finlay replied, "he smiled as if something had pleased him mightily, and waving his hand, disappeared." "And you expect me to believe such a cock-and-bull story as that?" the colonel said slowly. "It's the truth, sir," Corporal Finlay said slowly. "Sergeant Scott can corroborate it, for he was with me all the time." "There's no need to do that," the colonel answered, "for I know you have spoken the truth. This is by no means my first experience with ghosts. Only, for goodness' sake, do you and Sergeant Scott say nothing about it to the other men. If you do, there won't be an ounce of nerves left among them by the morning. Germans are one thing, but ghosts another. It was a splendid revenge for Sergeant Mackay." The stories I have just narrated must be taken for what they are worth. Though I believe they were told me in good faith, I cannot vouch for them. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17, the final chapter of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 17, A Case from Japan. Since Japan is a country in which I believe many people are intensely interested, I do not think I need apologize for introducing here the following account of a Japanese haunting. Never having been to Japan, I cannot lay claim to having had any ghostly adventures there myself, but as this is copied, word for word, from the manuscript of Mr. G. Salis, which was very kindly lent me for the purpose by Mrs. Salis, Mr. Salis's mother, I can most certainly answer for its authenticity. In the spring of 1913, I settled in the village of Akaji, in the southern island of Japan, in order to work a colliery. The country in this part is mountainous and quite off the track of any tourists, and the inhabitants remain in a very primitive condition. All the people are either farmers, miners, or the keepers of very small shops, and there is not a single hotel nor even an inn. I stayed at first in one of the rooms of a farmhouse, and, after a little while, was able to lease an old thatched farmhouse standing in a small orange orchard quite close to the colliery. Its owner lived in a little house at the back. My house was one-storied, but very high, the pitch of the thick thatch being very steep. On entering, one found a kitchen with various cooking places, but no chimneys, the smoke curling and losing itself among the huge rafters that supported the roof. The rest of the house was raised, and consisted of 4 rooms divided from each other by sliding paper-covered screens or fusuma, and with thick padded straw mats or tatami on the floor. I got a table and chair, and put up some bookshelves, and made the best room as habitable as possible. This room had a tokonama, or recess, painted a dark grey, and a scroll, a crystal, and a vase of flowers put in it gave the necessary decoration to the severely bare interior. For the first few months I slept in one of the back rooms, but later, when it got very hot, I only used the one room. I had one servant, and as we got up at dawn, we also went to sleep very early, and usually by 9 o'clock the house was in darkness and silence. One night I was awakened, and heard talking and laughing in the next room, only separated from me by a thin screen. Someone was telling a story in an animated voice, and his auditor every now and then ejaculated "Norohori," meaning to be sure, and "Sodasuka," is that so? But the voices were kept low and the laughs were subdued. Just then the kitchen clock struck 2. I was annoyed at my servant having friends in at that hour, and in the room next mine, and determining to have it out with him in the morning, I fell asleep. Next morning he absolutely denied that anyone had been in the house, and became very indignant when I insisted on what I had heard. 2 nights later I again heard a conversation going on, and reluctantly got out of bed and from under the mosquito curtains to investigate. A low chuckling laugh and then a snatch of song, and I pushed back the sliding fusuma. The room was in darkness, but I had a little electric torch which I used in the colliery, and, pressing its button, the room was brightly lit. Inside the mosquito curtain, Tanaka lay soundly sleeping. No one else was in the room. Indeed, but for the futon or mattress covered by the net, it was completely bare, and the talking still went on, seeming now to come from the room behind me. I awoke Tanaka, and we went out into the garden. No one was stirring, and the sounds came from inside the house. Away down the road 3 miners were returning from a night shift, and my servant wanted to run and fetch them. But I did not see the object of doing so. The mosquitoes were very bad, and I wanted to get back under the nets, conversations or no conversations, and so we re-entered the house. Silence reigned, and I went back to bed, but not to sleep, for the remainder of that night. Tanaka took the opportunity, while I was at the colliery the next morning, to pack up his few belongings and decamp, leaving a letter saying he could not stay in a house frequented by demons. I got a girl in from the village as a makeshift, and afterwards another servant, but no one would stay in the house after nightfall. I moved my bed into a room at the back, but still used the other room as a living room, and soon became used to the fact that it was haunted. Often, during the day, there were noises coming from near the tokonoma or recess, as though someone was cracking his finger joints, a habit the Japanese have. On several occasions, flowers put in the vase below the hanging scroll were taken out of their vase and arranged lying on a tray. One afternoon I brought my bed into the room, as the autumn was now getting cold, and I had been unwell for some days and wanted the benefit of the afternoon sun. I sent the servant to buy some stamps at the post office, a mile away, and stepped into the garden to gather some late dahlias. Looking up, I distinctly saw a movement in the room I had left, through the pane of glass let into the paper-covered shoji. Dropping my flowers, I pressed my face against the pane, and saw the bedclothes, which the servant and myself had arranged only 5 minutes previously, had been whisked off and were lying on the floor. Twice after this, coats hung on a peg near the tokonoma were found almost immediately lying on the floor at some distance, one having been pulled from its peg with such force as partly to tear it. On many nights, when I woke up, I heard talking in the next room, and gradually came to distinguish a man's voice. Sometimes I thought two men's, and certainly that of a woman and a baby. All the village were now talking of the haunted house, and now and then neighbors came in to listen to the mysterious sounds that came, from time to time, from the tokonoma, but they took good care to be gone before sunset. Winter had now come, and I fell ill, and as the only really pleasant room in the house was made impossible during the long sleepless nights, I redoubled my endeavour to find another house. A baby's wailings were very distinct, then it was hushed by its mother, and then long conversations ensued between her and one or two men. Sometimes there were little taps, as though a tobacco pipe were being emptied of its ashes, but more often a curious noise was heard which sounded like putter-putter. About this time, an account appeared in all the Japanese newspapers of a bridge in Tokejo which was haunted by a woman, and how this spirit had been laid by priestly intervention, and it was suggested that the same might be tried in the present case. I thought it rather a good plan, but, seeing that it was rather expensive, said that the landlord and not his foreign tenant should defray the cost and arrange the matter. But my landlord, who was very unpopular in the village, and with whom I was not on very good terms, would do nothing. And as, just then, another house near the colliery became vacant, I was able to move, and so at last be free of my ghostly visitants. Everyone knew of the reason for my leaving, and the landlord felt sure he would never find another tenant. After the house had been empty for some time, the landlord himself determined to live in it for some months, in order to demonstrate that things were not so bad after all. He and his wife and their two grandchildren accordingly moved their things across from their other house, but did not at first occupy the room with the tokonoma. Seeing, however, that their object in being in the house at all would be defeated unless this room was used, they hung some pictures in the recess, placed a bronze flower vase on a carved stand below them, and also moved in a gilt shrine containing an image of Buddha. A few friends were asked in, but all left at sunset. Next morning I heard that there had been considerable disturbance at the house, and that the younger grandson had been taken with convulsions. The same day a move was made again to their former abode. The house was closed, and still remains empty. A temple on a hill nearby was being repaired, and, on the completion of the work, a priest came to hold a service. The headman of the village took the opportunity of consulting with him, and together they went to see my late landlord. The facts brought to light, many of which were vaguely known in the district, are as follows. The house had been built about 150 years previously by the head of the family, which was then of more consequence than at present, although it still owned considerable property in pine forests and rice fields. A younger brother of the original builder had conspired against his feudal lord and had committed suicide, Harry. It was not known in which room, but probably it was in the principal one. The next tragedy, that was known of, had happened some 15 years before, when the son-in-law, the father of the two boys already mentioned, was found hanging from a hook near the wooden ceiling of the room with the tokonoma. He had been away for some time in Tokejo, had spent a great deal of money, and on his return had quarrelled violently with his wife. She had run out of the house with her children and had stayed on the hillside all night. Next morning her husband was found as above stated. Some months later, again in the same room, on the eve of the birth of her posthumous child, this woman killed herself by drinking poison, made from the leaves of a shrub still growing in the garden. During the convulsions which preceded her death, the child was born, but dead. The priest said there was no doubt that the spirits of these various people, related by family ties and lives, passed among the same surroundings, and who had all come to a dreadful violent end in the same house, and probably the same room, were earthbound, and were in the habit of assembling and conversing in the room where their lives had come to an end. Each addition would strengthen and intensify their bondage, and the priest expressed his surprise that the spirits were not actually visible. There was a good deal of discussion as to the terms for a service and ceremony to free the house from these ghostly tenants and to give them rest. I offered a small sum, but as they were, after all, the relations of the landlord, it was upon him that the bulk of the expense fell, and he refused to provide the necessary funds. His argument was that, even with the spirits laid, no one now would rent the house, and so he would not spend any money on it. Whether he also thought that the spirits were as happy holding their ghost parties round the tokonoma as they would be if they were at rest, he did not say, as such thoughts would be contrary to all Japanese ideas on the subject. Anyway, the house is now closed, the heavy wooden shutters are rolled across the verandas and bolted, the garden is overgrown and choked with weeds, and the only time when there is human activity about it is when the orange trees, burdened with fruit, yield their golden harvest. Signed, G. Salas. To revert again to my own experiences, I am often sorry, extremely sorry, I was ever brought into contact with the unknown. As I said in one of the early chapters of this book, I did not go out of my way to seek the superphysical. It came to me, and it has never given me any peace. I feel its presence beside me at all times. In the evening, when I am writing, the curtains that are tightly drawn across the closed windows slowly bulge. The candlestick on the mantel-shelf rattles. A picture on the wall swings out suddenly at me, and when I go to bed and try to sleep, I frequently hear breathings and faraway whispers. Some of these presences, no doubt, have been with me always. Most probably they were with my ancestors, whilst others have attached themselves to me in my nocturnal ramblings. My wife, who was a confirmed disbeliever before our marriage, has long since thrown aside her skepticism, and for a good reason. She has had many startling proofs of the power the spirit has of making itself manifest. The night a near relative of mine died, both she and I heard a loud crash on the panel of our bedroom door. And I, though I only, saw a hooded figure standing there. Also, besides having heard the banshee, my wife has seen objects moved by superphysical agency, seen them fanned by a wind that is apparently non-existing, had small stones and other articles thrown at her, and heard all sorts of queer, unaccountable sounds, laughs, sighs, and moans. 3 ghostly incidents have happened to me within the past 12 months. The first was in Red Lion Square. It was twilight. I was alone on the top floor of the house, and no one else was in the building, saving the daughter of the caretaker, who was in the basement. Suddenly footsteps, slow, ponderous footsteps, began to ascend the stairs, which, being uncarpeted and of oak, carried the sound from the hall. Wondering who it could be, I called out. There was no reply, and the steps drew nearer. On the landing immediately beneath me, they halted. I went out and looked down. No one was to be seen, and the steps immediately began to descend. I followed them right down, a few stairs behind, till they reached the hall, where they abruptly ceased. I learnt afterwards that these footsteps were quite a common phenomenon in the house, which had long been haunted by them. My second experience occurred in the Moscow Road, Bayswater. Feeling a heavy weight on my bed one night, and wishing to remove it, I put out my hand. It was immediately seized and held in a warm grip. I sat up in bed, but could see no one. The hand that clasped mine was very soft and small, unmistakably that of a woman. I felt the wrist and forearm, but beyond the elbow there was nothing. I was rather alarmed at this occurrence at the time, as I have a friend who died shortly after experiencing a similar phenomenon. In my case, however, the lady, whose hand I immediately identified as the hand that had clasped mine, and this lady solemnly declared that upon the same night we compared dates. She had dreamed of a hand which was the exact counterpart of mine, and that, upon shaking hands with me that afternoon, she had been instantly reminded of her dream. That there was nothing in common between us, her tastes and outlook on life being absolutely at variance with mine, makes the occurrence, in my opinion, none the less interesting, though somewhat difficult to account for. My last experience occurred only a few days ago, as I was sitting on the stairs of a haunted house near Ealing. I had applied to the landlord for permission to spend the night there, and, pending his reply, had obtained the keys from the agent in order to see what the house was like by daylight. Having just finished jotting down some notes, a memorandum of something I had suddenly thought of, I paused, still holding the pencil in my hand, whilst my notebook lay open on my knee. I had not sat thus for more than a minute when, with a thrill of surprise, I felt the pencil suddenly taken from my hand, and, looking down, I distinctly saw it, of its own accord, scrawl right across my book. Whether what I afterwards found written in my notebook was written by the spirit that haunted the house, or by a projection of one of my own personalities, I cannot say. Neither can I, myself, nor anyone to whom I have shown the symbolic writing, tell what it means. The appended is a facsimile. I might add that this is my one and only experience of spirit writing, and also that it was my one and only experience in the haunted house near Ealing, as I did not succeed in getting leave to spend a night there. Although I must confess I have made little progress so far in my investigations, for my failure to decipher spirit writing is not the only setback that I have encountered, I still have hopes. I hope that some day, when I am brought face to face with the unknown, in a haunted house or elsewhere, I may be able to hit upon some mode of communication with it, and discover something that may be of real service both to myself and to the rest of humanity. If only I could overcome fear. It is March 28th, midnight, and as I pen these concluding words, my mind reverts to the symbols and the date, March 28th, 12 o'clock. Suddenly I hear footsteps, distant footsteps on the road outside, coming in the direction of the house. I glance at my wife, wondering whether she hears them too. She is asleep, however, and as I covertly watch her, I see a look of terror gradually steal into her face. Clicking steps. They come nearer and nearer. They stop for a moment at our door, and then, thank God, pass slowly on. I look out of the window. The road is absolutely deserted, but from close at hand the sounds are wafted to me. Click, 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 fainter, 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 until they abruptly cease. This is the end of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter, written by Elliott O'Donnell and narrated by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Thank you for listening.